What Netanyahu is trying to do, though, is a complete rewrite of history. Netanyahu, in his own autobiography, writes that Bennett and Lieberman were trying to push to an invasion to Gaza, and I was against it because I knew that we had bigger fish to fry. And now he's writing in this new report, he brings cherry-picked quotes that he pulls out of classified transcripts that only he has access to.
The relations between Israel and Australia have
there's been some drama.
deteriorated. 3 of the names on the list are historical capo figures.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, Jacob Laznik. Prime Minister Netanyahu is currently in Washington, where he'll be meeting with Trump and other officials to discuss a plethora of subjects, including Iran and Gaza. As things stand now, the tensions in Iran and this question of will they, won't they regarding a potential U.S. or Israeli joint strike. Currently, Israel and the rest of the world is waiting to see if the U.S. will choose military action or to force Iran into a deal, raising questions of if a deal would even be effective or it just gives Trump an off-ramp. All of this comes as Israel is still reeling from security protocols of October 7th that Netanyahu released shortly before his departure. These hand-picked protocols shed light and give insights into some of the systematic security failures that led to the October 7th massacre and the unclear IDF response. That being said, these are only the protocols that Netanyahu decided to release, as opposed to the formation of a proper inquiry into the October 7th massacre. But that's a lot, so here to discuss all of this, we're joined by author, co-founder of Mead, and most importantly, columnist and former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, Jacob Katz. Jacob Katz, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you.
The pressing thing for right now that's kind of on everyone's mind is Iran, specifically separate from the protests, but the issue of, is the U.S. going to strike? Is the U.S. going to make a deal? What does Israel want? For some time now, since the protests have heated up, people have been wondering, is this the night I'm going to have to go into shelters? What's your take?
Donald Trump has built up probably an unprecedented military presence in the Middle East, at least nothing that has been seen in this region since the invasion of Iraq back in 2003.
Yeah.
Now, when you look, though, at what Donald Trump actually wants, and he's now made this very clear, and he said this by himself, he wants a deal, and he prioritizes a deal. And it kind of makes sense when you look at the whole sequence of events. Trump says help is on its way. He sends the so-called armada, the aircraft carriers, the destroyers, the squadrons, the submarines, etc. And he uses that as a pressure over the regime to get them to enter into a deal with him, which has always been his priority. I mean, I take you back in time, Jake, to 2018, when Trump pulled out of the previous nuclear deal, what was called the JCPOA that Obama reached in 2015. And back then, his talking point was, I'm pulling out of this deal because it's a bad deal, but come talk to me, let's make a good deal. Problem was the Iranians never came to talk to him. And then when Biden was in office for those 4 years, they never really came to talk to Biden, even though he did try in the beginning to get them back into the JCPOA.
Right.
Now Trump sees an opportunity. The opportunity is to make a deal, right? He wants a deal that probably, if it was up to him, would only really include the nuclear file. He doesn't really...
Not the missiles.
Yeah, the missiles for him are not the main issue. They're an issue for us.
Right.
They're probably, as of now, because nuclear is still a couple of years away, if they were to make the decision to build the bomb, the missiles is the main threat that we face in this moment.
Yeah, it's also what we faced in June.
It's also what we faced in June when they fired about 500 missiles, 10% got through, and we saw what they were able to do. I mean, you go to places, still go to Bat Yam or the Weizmann Institute, or you go down to Beersheba. I mean, you could see the real damage that they were causing and the people who were killed. So, I mean, definitely that's a real danger today. I think, though, that where Trump is with this, and this is what Netanyahu is trying in his visit that he had on Wednesday and his meetings with Trump, what he tried to do is get Trump to agree, first of all, that the deal needs to include not just the nuclear file, also the missiles, and ideally also support of the terrorist proxies. By the way, this is putting aside whether the Iranians would ever accept such a deal.
Of course.
But let's say this should be the priority. And then the second thing that Netanyahu wanted from Trump is, can we set a deadline, right? Mm-hmm. Can we agree that we're only going to allow this to go on for X number of days? Let's remember, June, Israel attacked, I think it was June 13th, right?
Yeah.
On the 60th day of when the deadline ended, essentially, for that window that Trump had given the Iranians. He wants another deadline. He wants another kind of, okay, if they don't make the deal by now, there will be a military strike. And with that presence in the region, that's a lot of leverage for the president. The question is, though, can Israel achieve in getting Trump to agree to all of these different conditions? And I'll add just one other thing,
Sure.
is which I'm personally concerned about. If you look at America today, right, the U.S. has no real appetite for a war.
Right.
They love the Maduro operation, Delta Force.
In and out, 5 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In and out, grab the guy, take him. He's in America now, standing trial. That's the best way to do things, right? So-called regime change. Obviously, that's not in the cards here for Iran.
Right.
So the question is, if Israel appears, at least in America, to be dragging or pulling or pushing the U.S. into a big military adventure and war in the Middle East, that won't go over well, right? The Democrats don't want that. They don't like us already. And even in the Republican Party, you now have a split. You have the America First group who...
No new wars.
Right. Who don't want wars and have even isolationist tendencies. And then they look at this group that they call the Israel First group within the party, which is a toxic term if you ask me.
Right.
So already you have a split within the Republican Party to some extent. And if Netanyahu is seen as dragging Trump into a war, it's going to make Israel look even worse in the U.S. And that's something we have to keep in mind as well.
Right.
Now, of course, Iran is a great threat. So you're going to have to prioritize everything and try to find that right balance between all of these different interests.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. I think so. Let's go back first to the deal itself that Trump is trying to achieve, and let's try to investigate into what that actually wants. Because if we look back at June, we also remember that, at least from what I remember, that in June America was trying to get Iran to sign a deal, and at the time there were also concerns from the Israeli side about, what are the terms of this deal, and will it actually be effective, and will this in fact eliminate the possibility of a nuclear Iranian threat, or is this going to be a kind of similar deal to the JCPOA on paper, maybe with some tweaks here and there, and you could put Trump's name on it, but it doesn't actually ensure security. And I think a lot of the times when we start to think about strikes and potential, backlash and the protests going on, so regime change and all these possibilities and whatever, a topic that isn't really discussed a lot is what would this actual deal look like? Even if Trump, let's say he does want to include the ballistic missiles and it's just the nuclear aspect, what kind of limitations are we talking about that he wants, and what would be deemed acceptable by Israel even?
It's a very good question because there are real differences.
Yeah.
And the differences, let's just mention for a moment where they stem from. Israel is geographically right next to Iran, pretty much. And therefore, when we think about the Iranian nuclear threat and the development of a ballistic missile, they have missiles that could carry a nuclear warhead potentially to Israel.
Yeah.
They don't yet have missiles that can carry a nuclear warhead to the United States. So right there is the urgency.
We're in the splash
of the
zone.
threat.
We've seen
exactly.
it. Yeah.
So we can't gamble and play with our security when it comes to this. And America can. And there's an ocean, and that ocean provides something that we just don't have.
Right.
So that explains the differences. Look, Israel wants to see a deal that as we mentioned before, nuclear, missiles, and support of terrorist proxies. Let's assume support of terrorist proxies is not even really relevant, because let's say the Iranians say, sure, we're not going to fund Hezbollah anymore. So they'll give the money to some charity, and that charity will fund Hezbollah. They'll find ways to circumvent that. The ballistic missile, they are now believed to have a few thousand that they've been able to recoup since the June war. Israel would want to see restrictions on the production, maybe even a disarmament, a limitation on the range of those missiles. Right now, they have they could reach over 1,000 kilometers and even 2,000 kilometers. Israel want to see just a few hundred kilometers. If it's just for self-defense, why do they need missiles that can reach Israel or even inch already into mainland Europe? Not sure that the Iranians would ever agree to something like that. By the way, Israel would never agree to something like that either. Although we definitely don't have the ambitions of regional hegemony and terrorism that the Iranians have. But that's something that's a big ask of the country. When it comes to nuclear, what I think Israel and America, and here they're aligned, is zero enrichment. And you hear that from the Americans. I'll remind you that back during the 60-day window ahead of June, Steve Witkoff was a little wishy-washy on the enrichment issue. In the end, he came on to the Israeli side that said zero enrichment. We're seeing now no daylight on that issue. The question, though, will be, do they, in the end, get some sort of concession that they're allowed enrichment to a very low level, which, by the way, was included in the JCPOA. Originally, it was just to be about 3 or 4 or 5%. And then they increased to 20, and then they increased eventually to 60%, just shy of the 90% military-grade uranium. So the question here is that will be in the details, right? Mm-hmm. There's the 400 kilos of enriched uranium to over 60% that are believed to be buried
survived
survived the June War and are buried maybe somewhere in Fordow or Isfahan. That quantity, that amount, Israel and the U.S., by the way, want to see removed entirely from Iran.
Right.
There's been talk of maybe the Russians or the Turks taking possession of this. That remains to be seen. But this is going to come down to enrichment and to, of course, no steps moving forward on any weapons program. Trump, the last thing he wants, right? Maybe even he doesn't want this even more than a war in the Middle East, is to be called your Barack Obama 2.0. Right. And your deal is just the JCPOA now. You sold us all down the river. Yeah. Like Barack Obama did. That's the last thing that he wants to see happening. And therefore, what I try to tell people is, don't look at this just from a security perspective. Look at it from the political perspective of the story and the narrative that Donald Trump will be able to say, mostly how he's not Barack Obama.
Of course.
What's needed in any deal that's going to come is obviously you need leverage and you need, I would argue, snapback sanctions, right? Mm-hmm. So any deal that's going to be reached with the Iranians is they have to have a carrot, right? What is the carrot? The carrot is you stop enrichment, you stop the nuclear program, maybe you stop also the ballistic missile program, and in exchange, you will get the lifting of sanctions, et cetera, and maybe even investment. To keep that viable, you need to have a very quick return to sanctions within days, if that's the decision that's made. And by the way, it would have to include, this was one of the positive things of the JCPOA. JCPOA is very flawed.
Right.
But one of the positive elements of the JCPOA was that the snapback sanctions, which were actually snapped back by countries just a few months ago in October, did not require going back to the UN Security Council. Right. And if you had to go back to the UN Security Council, remember, China, Russia have a veto. So the 2015 deal, the snapback mechanism didn't require any reapproval.
It circumvented the whole flaw.
Correct. Now to do that once again will be very difficult. China won't come on board. Right. Russia will not come on board. Trump, I'm guessing, will try in any deal that he makes to bring the Europeans at least with him, and maybe India or some other countries. He's not going to get China or Russia to come with him. So that's going to be one flaw already within Trump's new deal if one is reached. But it has to have a stick with it, and that could include the snapback sanctions. But it will also maybe include giving Israel, look, you can do what you got to do if this happens, or maybe even we'll do it if it happens under the Trump administration. By the way, I'll just say one other thing, and I would presume that this will be spoken about, right? Because what we have to remember is that if Trump reaches a deal, even if we say it's a terrible deal, Israel's hands are tied, right? Israel will not be able to attack. Israel will not be able to undermine the deal. It will have to
even further. Netanyahu would have to say this is a great deal, and we're seeing eye to eye.
Oh yeah, and Trump is the best president.
Yeah, exactly.
Since, Truman recognized the state of Israel in 1948.
Yeah. Now looking to Iran, you mentioned how there's no deadline yet for this deal. Can we expect Iran to play ball? Does Iran feel cornered? Does it feel that it has to reach a deal, or are they going to be defiant, especially if there's no deadline set?
The regime, the Ayatollahs, have a very strong grip over the people and over their country. And very difficult to remove a government without putting boots on the ground and without really doing an invasion and having someone who's in place to replace whatever government you topple. But we also have to remember something else, is that even with their success in quelling the protests, by the way, at the price of killing thousands and thousands of people and injuring tens of thousands of others, the Iranian regime and this government and the IRGC is at its weakest point since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, right? And I think you have to look at it in the context of much more than the last decade. But let's look at it just in the context of the last, what are we now? 9 months since the June War. Israel destroyed all their air defense systems pretty much, degraded significantly their ballistic missile capability. Their nuclear program has been set back years, and if not more,
Right.
and now is on the threat of more. And the financial, the economic situation is in shambles, right? And the Iranian people just waged the greatest battle, the greatest public uprising against the Ayatollahs and against the regime since its founding back in 1979. So when they look out their window and they look into the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, whatever it's called, and they see the Armada, the Lincoln, and all the USS Lincoln, and all these other destroyers, and the fact that the George H.W. Bush might be coming in the next week or two, and they have to say to themselves, okay, this is here for us.
Right.
We don't have a way to defend ourselves, really. We could cause some damage, but they will have aerial superiority and dominance over our skies within
minutes.
Within a day, if at the greatest. Is it worth it? And they will cause real damage. And by the way, I would expect, and this is not with knowledge, but I would expect that any war that breaks out, if the Iranians do attack Israel, see, America might want to do something just to, say we did something. But if they do fire missiles into Israel, I mean, all gloves are off.
Right.
Israel will go into Iran, will reestablish the aerial dominance and the superiority, and will attack not just nuclear and ballistic missiles. I mean, think of the entire Navy, their oil tankers, their oil refineries, their the government institutions, bridges, power grids, plants, water facilities. I mean, think of how much damage Israel could potentially cause.
Also, infrastructure that they can't really afford to lose.
They can't afford to lose. They don't have money to rebuild.
They don't have water.
Right. I mean, and my heart goes out to the Iranian people. But if they want a war, this regime, then there is a lot of targets that are potentially
and also,
viable.
Unlike June, where Israel stated from the get-go, our targets are
correct
here and there. Like at the same time, Israeli jets were just flying over Tehran with absolutely no opposition.
I mean, I'll give you this number. We had, forget about Israeli jets is one thing. We had drones over Iranian airspace 24/7 around the clock. I mean, seeing targets and engaging targets. So some of them were attack drones, some of them were just surveillance drones. We had complete superiority over Iran, a country that's 2,000 kilometers away from here. I mean, that itself alone is brilliant. And by the way, not simple to achieve, and it will be a huge challenge to again achieve that if there's going to be a new war. But if I was Iran, and the Iranians know this, they know that this is happening, and they have to be concerned. So I granted they are flexing a muscle and they're threatening and they're trying to deter the West and they want to make us all scared. But really, they're the ones who should be scared, and I think they are scared.
For Israel, obviously, like the ideal outcome, I would say, is like regime change in Iran that doesn't require a prolonged conflict. Idealistically, the protest moves up and they remove all the people and all the security forces defect, and the regime is gone and great. That's not going to happen. But like obviously, in Iran that's not ruled by this regime that's funding all these proxies that is trying to eliminate Israel and kind of Jews worldwide is like the go-to. Given the current realistic context of how things are going now, what do you think is Israel's ideal?
I think if Israel had its way, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, priority number one, like you said, Jake, is regime change. I think that would be halavai, right?
It would be great for everybody.
It would be great for the entire world,
Literally.
right? Literally. Absent that, if there is a deal in place that is a good deal, with guarantees, with assurances that they can never develop a nuclear program or nuclear weapon, with limitations on their ballistic missiles, I think that is a better option for Israel than a war that just sets them back a few years, right? But again, it will have to be a deal with real teeth. If it's going to be a bad deal, like the JCPOA, then I would say it's probably preferable. Hit them really hard, weaken them, and then try to re-engage with them again. But it's going to be about the details, and really, I mean, it is in the details here. That's what it's going to come down to.
Phase 2 has officially begun. It's off to a slow start, but pieces are moving in Gaza. A lot of questions about the Board of Peace and the ISF and how is administration actually going to look like and so forth. But I want to actually skip over that for now. When I get back to it a bit later, but now that the hostages are home, and aside from some ceasefire violations here and there, the question is, are we ever going to truly know what actually happened on October 7th? That's the main thing. Like,
look, October 7th was a complete breakdown of anything that we thought we knew. right? It was a breakdown of intelligence. It was a breakdown of operational capacity. It was a breakdown of the political echelon. Everything. Everyone failed in the lead up to it, and everyone failed on that day as well. What Netanyahu is trying to do, though, is a complete rewrite of history, and it's revisionism. I mean, I've studied this very closely because I co-authored a book exactly on how October 7th happened. So I would say that I have some insight into it. Don't know everything, but let's say a little more than the average person. Netanyahu is not only changing what happened with his document, this 55 pages that I read, and trying to revise the historical record, but he's also contradicting himself. I mean, it's remarkable. Right. He goes back, for example, I'll give you one example. He goes back in 2014 during what was then called Operation Protective Edge, 50-day war in Gaza in the summer of that year. And I mean, everyone knows that Bennett and Lieberman were the ones who were pushing him at the time to launch a ground offensive in Gaza. Netanyahu didn't want it. Bogi Ya'alon, who's the defense minister, didn't want it. You could go back and look at how Egypt was offering one ceasefire after the other, and Bibi kept grabbing it and grabbing it and grabbing it. Hamas kept rejecting it. Finally, they started popping into Israel through these tunnels and killed soldiers, etc. And then Bennett finally got his way, and there was a limited incursion into Gaza that included just destroying the cross-border attack tunnels that were really close to the border. Netanyahu, in his own autobiography, which came up before October 7th, right, in 2022 when he was in the opposition, writes that Bennett and Lieberman were trying to push to an invasion to Gaza. And I was against it because I knew that we had bigger fish to fry, basically. We had to keep our focus on Iran, and I wasn't going to just have soldiers die for no reason, basically. And now he's writing in this new report, he brings cherry-picked quotes that he pulls out of, classified transcripts and from the cabinet meetings and security briefings, et cetera, that only he has access to because he's the prime minister.
And also, I think he's the one who has the privilege to release it.
And which is questionable, but let's assume that he has the legal privilege to declassify what he decides to declassify. Half quotes, a quote, and then ... and a continuation of quotes. So, as I said to one of his advisors, you wanna release the entire transcript? Go ahead. Let the public judge based on reading the entire transcript. But the fact that the guy who was prime minister and let's also say this, for 14 years, right, except for a year and a half, so 12 and a half years in the run-up to October 7th, the man who set the policy, the man who crafted Israel's approach to Gaza and to Hamas, the man who bears the greatest responsibility because he was in the chair on October 7th, is now the guy who can decide which quotes he wants to pick and what he will write in this document, in my view, is not only an escape from responsibility and accountability, but it's painful to watch and to read. And therefore, I find it very disturbing. So to your question of will we ever know, this is not the way we're going to know, right? And you got to ask yourself a different question. So Netanyahu knows that we'll sit here, or people like us will sit here and say these things. He's not stupid, right? It's not for me that he wrote this document. It's not for you. It's for his base. It's for his voters, and it's for that 45 to 48% of the Israeli electorate that votes for his bloc within the Knesset. But I'll say even more than that. Netanyahu is one of the only prime ministers, I think maybe the only prime minister in Israeli history, who has never established a commission of inquiry. So in all of his terms, the 3 years in the 90s, the now, what are we at, almost 17, about 15 and a half years that he's been prime minister. He returned to the prime minister's office next month in March of 2009. He was reelected. So, I mean, he came into office in May, but I mean, he's been here now for a very, very long time. He put all together almost 20 years the man has been prime minister, never established a commission of inquiry. He's not going to start doing that now, especially
on the biggest thing that he
on the biggest thing, and on the biggest failure and disaster that's ever happened in Israeli history. But here's the real sad part, Jake, that really pains me, is that let's say there's an election in June, in September, and October. Let's say the opposition wins and they establish a government. And then first thing they do is they say they vote to establish a commission of inquiry, state-appointed commission of inquiry. Half of Israel, the people on the street, will not believe a word it says. And if he gets his way and establishes the political commission of inquiry, half of Israel will not believe a word they say. So unfortunately, we're in a reality that people just won't believe anything. And you're going to, in either case, you're going to have half that's not going to accept what the other half believes.
My understanding of Israel's security, just based off of what I've read and my experience in the military, is that, rules and protocols are written in blood. And if failures happen, you look at them and you make changes. Based off of what I've seen and through the own IDF internal investigations, they say things like, on October 7th, there was a bigger concern about soldiers being kidnapped. So that's why a lot of soldiers were distanced from the border, and why there's this high-tech fence, and the fence is able to detect threats really fast. And then we saw on October 7th that really wasn't effective. And then 2 years later, I see that there's investment in these machines that can slide along the border fence. So we have even more tech, which can allow soldiers to be even further from the border. And I wonder, are we not just doomed to repeat the same mistake? Because if we already deem that to be ineffective, why are we repeating on this? And to me, what it seems like is, in order to implement a policy that will work, you have to first accept what happened, look at it, and then in order to change it. And I see from a structural level, if we're going to implement change that would put the policies in place to prevent an October 7th event from happening again, that would have to admit that A, B, C, and D happened.
I totally agree. 100%. I mean, you can't fix the mistakes if you don't know the mistakes.
You have to admit that it happened before.
Correct. Yeah. But there's another layer which I think touches upon something deeper, and that is the soul of the Israeli people. And this is the question of accountability. There was the greatest disaster in our history. 1,200 people slaughtered in the worst terms, the worst ways possible. 251 people taken hostage. 20 of them only released just a couple months ago. So many soldiers killed in this war. A war on multiple fronts. All of this happened. Not a single government minister has taken responsibility and stepped down. People in the IDF have stepped down. A couple people in the Shin Bet have stepped down. Maybe enough, maybe not enough. But I look at my kids, for example, right? I look at this country and I say, are they learning the right lesson? Mm-hmm. You make a mistake. There has to be accountability, right? I can't imagine somebody who's, I was once the editor of the Jerusalem Post. If I'm the editor of this newspaper and I make a horrific blunder, terrible mistake, something horrible happens on my watch, am I not responsible? Of course I am. And I should be made to be held responsible. For some reason, there's a culture in this country that avoids that accountability. And that culture is bad. It's rotten. And this is an opportunity to fix it. And we have to have that. I have no doubt, and the opposition has basically said this, that if they are elected and they do come into office, the first thing they will do is establish a state commissioner of inquiry. Here, though, you get into a bit of a question, though. Well, what if they don't have the numbers? And what if they have to rely on Arab votes? Will they do that? Gadi Eisenkot has said that they might. Naftali Bennett has said he would not allow that to happen. So, and Benny Gantz as well. So it raises a lot of serious questions. I don't know. I think there's also something to be said, and it's something to think about, right? But let's even say that the opposition gets 57 seats in an election. They don't yet have the 61, but if the Arabs abstain, they can vote in a minority government because they're more than the coalition.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one thing. But now they're going to vote on a state commissioner of inquiry that, again, they will require the Arabs to abstain in that vote or to vote in favor of state commissioner of inquiry. I mean, you know Israeli society, I know Israeli society. Even people who support the opposition won't like the fact that a state commission of inquiry into October 7th is being established with based on the votes of Arabs, right?
Yeah.
It's fine, it's legal.
I think it's not that big of an issue, but
you might think it's not such a big an issue. I don't think it's necessarily such a big an issue, but there are plenty of people who would say that further delegitimizes the state commission of inquiry. So I would actually caution that to do that with the Arab votes would even undermine even more the state commission of inquiry that's going to be established, and then further delegitimize whatever findings it comes out with that already half the countries anyhow, because as we said before, is not going to accept it.
I've spoken to a bunch of different experts on the show about phase 2, the terms, how things are developing. Is Israel mabsut? Are they happy with the end result, or are they a bit regretful with how this ended up? Are they okay? Are they going to try to change terms as things are developing? Is this the total victory that Israel has, bent its, put its flag on, or is this kind of a result that Israel is kind of having to live with?
Well, it's definitely not the total victory that Netanyahu promised the Israeli public, right? Hamas is in charge of 50% and in control of 50% of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is basically back inside the Gaza Strip. Someone who leaves the Rafah crossing is getting a stamp that says the State of Palestine. The Palestinian Commission that was established of technocrats to rule or govern Gaza is using the logo of the Palestinian Authority. So anything that we were told at some point by Prime Minister Netanyahu that Hamas will be obliterated, Hamas will not be in charge, the Palestinian Authority will not come back to Gaza. I mean, you can go back one to one, all of that never happened. On the other hand, though, and I mean, that's politics. That's not real substance. From a substantive perspective, there's room to be hopeful, but also to be very concerned. And maybe that's just every day in the Middle East, by the way. That's a description of any day here. Yeah. But Hamas is in control of 50% of Gaza. The question of disarmament is still unclear how that's going to play out, right? Now, will Hamas give up its weapons? Will they not give up its weapons? Will they give up all their weapons? Will they give up some of their weapons? That is key, because if they're allowed to stay and they're allowed to keep their weapons, then we're basically just saying to ourselves, okay, this is probably going to happen again
in a few
at some
years.
point.
Yeah.
It'll take maybe, instead of the usual, if we go back, if we look from the disengagement from Gaza in 2005 up until October 7th, 23, we probably had an operation every 2.5 years. So the average now might turn out to be 5 to 10 years. Great. Okay. Maybe that's a good day. I would say no. I mean, we should achieve more here. The reason, though, to be hopeful is because what I see is really the first time ever in decades of conflict, and decades of conflict specifically with Hamas, that the Western world and even the Arab world are for the first time taking responsibility for what's happening in the Gaza Strip. Mm-hmm. Right? So the Board of Peace, the Executive Committee, that's led by Nikolai Mladenov and others who are running now what's happening in Gaza. The Security Coordination Center down in Kiryat Gat with American and other foreign soldiers who are on the ground, who are coordinating every single piece of the rehabilitation and the construction and the insertion of aid, and what's going to happen with disarmament and what's going to happen with the ISF and what's going to happen with who's going to rule the civilian infrastructure, et cetera.
Notoriously, I think it's safe to say that Israel isn't very good at thinking forward as opposed to policy for right now. I don't mean for like security and like long ops, Mossad. I don't mean that. I mean like in terms of like policy thinking like the next 5-10 years down the line. So the Gaza Board of Peace, which initially started as this, idea for the administration of Gaza, then kind of transformed into this whole thing that people now think might be mini UN. There's this very complex charter that has a lot of these stipulations that are very Trump focused about his tenure and his remaining 3 years in office. I think it reads kind of akin to a lot of his tariffs and legislations are by executive order, and so like there's this issue or concern of like consistency and the fact that it will stay even after he's gone. If you're Israel, and for the next 3 years at least, any issue regarding Gaza security, Gaza administration, this board is going to be involved with Trump at the helm. How does Israel ensure that whatever happens in the next 3 years, and I don't mean from like the reforming PA like side of it, how does Israel ensure that this administrative body or some semblance of an administrative body is going to continue and make the work like continue to happen and not have it hinge on one person's presidency?
No. It's a great question, and it's a big challenge, because if this is just about Donald Trump, then it's going to be tough to sustain, because what we're looking at is a process that is going to last many, many years, if not decades. Right. And therefore, what Israel needs to do, and I like what you said in the beginning, because I totally agree with it, and it's an issue that I've tried to deal with over the years as well in writing and speaking about. We're not good at long-term policy. Right. We're not good at saying, okay, this is the vision. This is where we want to get to. So like, if I apply that for a moment to the Palestinian and the West Bank, let's say, Judea and Samaria. And if I said I want to annex Judea and Samaria, then there are steps I could start doing towards annexation.
Right.
And if my idea is, and my vision is no, not annexation, but 2 states, even if it's not possible, let's say for 50 years, but there are steps that I could start taking now towards ensuring that when it is possible, it will actually work.
Right.
But we decide not to decide. It's an active decision not to make a decision. And I think we're facing that now also in the Gaza Strip. We have to decide what it is that we want to work towards. And if it's just in the here and now and kind of dribble the ball and try to wait out Trump and then see what comes next and see where we are, and basically the strategy be, well, Hamas is going to violate it, so then the war will restart and resume anyhow, that's not a strategy, right? That's a tactic. The strategy has to be, what do we want to see happen? And then when you know what your end game is, you can work backwards and start to lay out and draft that roadmap to get yourself there. We have yet to do that work. And there's a reason why. Because there's a political price to pay. Right. Because whichever way you go, when you make that big decision, you're going to upset people. And this has been the Netanyahu doctrine, essentially, to some extent, is never to have to make those big decisions. But hopefully, we are in that process of making those decisions, because some of them are being made for us. And I would rather see them made by the Israeli people when it comes to our security than actually be forced down our throat by whether it's our best friend Trump or some other government and administration that's going to come in the future.
Yeah, no, I was saying a lot of times Israel is very upset that, and accusatory even, that countries don't consider Israel's security and Israel's needs and Israel's interests, but then at some point we ourselves have to say what that is too. Otherwise, if we don't bring it up, we can't expect it to be respected. I think we touched up on the here and now. So, thank you for coming and sharing
Jake.
your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
While Jews around the world are still reeling from the tragic Bondi Beach massacre in Sydney, Australia, we also secretly hoped that this event would be the wake-up call that would cause not just Australia, but governments around the world to finally take anti-Semitism as a serious problem, give it the attention, treatment, policy, and enforcement that it deserves. However, what we've seen this week shows that this is exactly not the case. President Isaac Herzog embarked on a solidarity visit this week to Australia, where he met with the Prime Minister, Jewish public figures, and the Jewish community in various cities. What was supposed to be a trip of support and solidarity quickly turned into political protests and clashes with police. Here to discuss the events that unfolded over there, we're joined by our Diaspora correspondent, Mathilda Heller. Always a pleasure to have you. Thank you for coming back.
Always a pleasure to be on.
So, as we've seen this week, obviously, Israel President Isaac Herzog visited Australia. He's visited a bunch of different cities and a bunch of different Jewish communities there, and has taken part in some events to commemorate the horrific Bondi Beach shooting. He obviously arrives after the invitation from Jewish groups, and he's there now. But over the week, the news around it has been a lot less quiet than one would expect from something of this manner, because of, protests and other things. So why don't you break down for us what's been happening over there?
Isaac Herzog is indeed on his official visit currently to Australia. And as you said, on the invitation of Jewish groups. But it is also a visit to meet with the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and a bunch of other Australian political figures. He's already spoken at Moriah College, which is a Jewish school. He's set to speak at other Jewish events, and has been in Sydney, is heading to Canberra. As expected, his visit has been met with a significant amount of outrage, one could say, from anti-Israel Australians, both in the form of pro-Palestinian protest groups, also anti-Israel Jewish groups. And the protests themselves have been a lot more aggressive and antagonistic than perhaps the police were expecting. Now, ahead of the protests, which were expected by the New South Wales police, ahead of these protests, the New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns, was given special permission to extend protest-related regulations in order to declare this visit as a major event, something that's typically given to sporting events. And this allows the police to take special measures to ensure public safety, such as moving protesters on from certain areas so they can't stay there. Also, they're allowed to do searches of any individuals within the CBD, which is the Central Business District, and surrounding areas in Sydney. And also, there are certain measures which allow stationary protests but prohibit marches through certain areas. So essentially, there are much tighter regulations on what protests are allowed. Now, this has been defied already, and we're currently looking at least 27 arrests, 9 of which so far have led to charges. The majority of these have been for assaulting police officers. There have been 10 police officers assaulted so far.
Okay.
And some additional things, public disorder, this kind of thing. And additionally to that, the Palestine Action Group Sydney, which is kind of the sister organization of the group that's been prescribed in the UK, challenged the protest restrictions in court. They made a legal challenge, and that was overruled. So their challenge was dismissed. They asked to be able to, protest as normal, and this was dismissed. However, they also defied this. So we're beginning to see this sort of conflict between the legislation and the intention of that legislation, but like the lack of enforcement on the ground. There's been a lot of outcry though over the last 24 hours specifically, because some have argued that police took overly zealous measures to combat protest behavior. There was pepper spray used quite extensively, which can cause physical after effects, not lasting, but it's not comfortable. And there have also been incidents of physical altercations between police officers and protesters. Some have alleged that they were punched, and a 69-year-old woman has claimed that 4 of her vertebrae were broken by police officers, and she's in the hospital. The other thing that attracted a decent amount of attention was a public Muslim prayer, which the police they interrupted it and dragged some of the prayer, those praying away. And this has just been condemned by the National Council of Imams, the Australian Council of Australian Imams. So there's definitely been a lot of tension in Australia amidst this protest. It's receiving, as you said, a lot more attention, both from the media and from the public, than most other foreign state officials' visits to the country would. But this makes sense given it's the first visit of a president since Reuben Rivlin in 2020, and since then we've had the entire Israel-Hamas war.
Right.
So slightly different geopolitical context.
And so just to clarify for listeners, so obviously what they're saying that the protests are about is about specifically Herzog's visit, not about like the existence of a memorial,
right?
But of Herzog's visit. And a lot of the protesters, a lot of groups they're basically accusing him of being a war criminal.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, that unlike, for example, Prime Minister Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant, there aren't any upstanding accusations by any international or warrants by any international authorities that would say that there's the even possibility that he would be considered a war criminal. And instead, this accusation kind of comes more from local anti-Israel, pro-Palestine groups. So, like, is that the case, or is he actually considered a war criminal by some? But like,
no. Okay. It's more by association of being part of like Israeli leadership and Israel being deemed by many to be a criminal entity. Some pictures have surfaced of for example, Isaac Herzog signing like weapons used by the IDF, wishing them good luck in their service, and others interpreting, like mistranslating it as death to Gazans, which it didn't say. But there is no existing arrest warrant or anything. Obviously, there are many in Australia who have called for that to be the case. As I mentioned, Palestine Action Group Sydney specifically is kind of running on the slogan of protest is legal and genocide is not, kind of thing, and have called for his arrest. They've also called for the current Premier of New South Wales, Chris Minns, to step down. Albanese himself has stood by the visit, saying that he needs the temperature to be turned down. He said this yesterday. He needs people to turn down the temperature in Australia, and he has said that while he'll look into kind of reports of police brutality, that he essentially said, and I quote, like, I'll allow the police to do their job, or I'll let the police do their job. So despite significant unrest, it appears that the Australian government, is essentially being very cooperative with this visit. And Herzog himself stated today that he's intending to rebuild bilateral relations, something which is, the relations between Israel and Australia have
there's been some drama,
deteriorated somewhat, and he wants to reinvigorate those somewhat with this visit. But that, as mentioned, is not the primary reason for the visit. This isn't like a state political visit. This is a solidarity visit post-Bondi massacre. And it's something that the majority of Jewish Australians, a population of somewhere between 110 and 120,000, are very much in support of.
That is an interesting discussion that I do want to get into, but I do want to highlight there was like a specific act of protest that made headlines that I think was very interesting for multiple reasons, was that the Jewish Council of Australia published a what they claimed was an ad of 1,000 signatories saying Jews say no to Herzog, essentially this isn't our name, he doesn't represent us. Aside from the fact that only just a sliver of the Jewish population, as you just mentioned, there's a bunch of fun other little tidbits and Easter eggs in this letter. So I was wondering if you could share some of those with us.
Sure. This is a story that I covered specifically. As mentioned, the Jewish Council of Australia is very much considered by mainstream Australian Jewry to be a fringe organization.
Yeah.
It's taken a progressively more anti-Zionist stance, has pro-Palestinian kind of mission statement, etc. And there are mainstream Jewish organizations such as the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, Zionist Federation of Australia, etc., who disavow the Jewish Council of Australia. Now, the Jewish Council of Australia paid for 2 full-page advertisements in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, which are 2 big Australian newspapers. And as mentioned, it's supposed to have a list of Jews who are against Herzog's visit. The title is Jews Say No to Herzog. When I went through the list, and there were many other people on social media who were sort of eagle-eyed about this list, there are some signs that not all the names are legitimate people. The first indicator was the inclusion of a Hebrew transliterated phrase, which means butt lecker, essentially, milket techan. And that was an indication that someone submitted this and it wasn't verified. Additionally to that, there are 3 listed actual capos. Now, a capo is a person who collaborated or aided the Nazi regime during the Holocaust. For example, like working with the Nazis inside a concentration camp. And 3 of the names on the list are historical capo figures, such as...
Were submitted and not vetted.
Exactly, not vetted. Also indicating that they were submitted by people who view the JCA to be a capo organization, like a Jews are going against Jews kind of thing. There's also a name that is a Marvel comic name, and there are also names on the list of people who very much didn't sign this petition and are actively pro-Israel individuals, such as David and Tammy Slade, who are currently in Israel and are active pro-Israel Zionist figures. David is on the United Israel Appeal of Victoria. He's the president of that. And they've both come out and given statements saying, we didn't sign this, we didn't give consent. And in the comment sections of these posts were other people saying, I also didn't sign this or give consent. So essentially what was meant to be a show of kind of strength from the JCA against Herzog has become a subject of ridicule. And it's been widely covered across social media platforms and also by various media outlets such as Daily Mail Australia and the like.
It seems like there wasn't really kind of any vetting. There was actually no real personal connection between the application to the signature, and it was just of like... And
it also, while they did say it was Jews and the signature of Jews, there's also not 1,000 on the list. There's less than 700. On the polling petition itself, you can sign I'm Jewish or I'm a non-Jewish ally. So there's the option to be not Jewish. And many did comment on the fact that significant numbers of the names on the list do not appear to be Jewish names, although that is not an exact science and not something that I would want to engage in particularly. But nevertheless, the option remained for people to be not Jewish. I found several comments on Facebook of people saying, I'm not Jewish and I signed. So that's a strong indicator. So essentially it's misleading. And also, even if all of these people were Jews who are against Herzog, every single one was a real person, it would still constitute significantly less than 1% of the Australian Jewish community. And Australian Jews that I spoke to yesterday expressed frustration that mainstream newspapers are platforming such fringe organizations and their views about a visit, that the majority of mainstream organizations are completely not in agreement around, and, you know, very much welcoming the president, very much in support of Israel. In fact, kind of more recent surveys of Australian Jewry found that 88%, I believe, at least over 80% of Australian Jews have visited Israel once. I think it was around 60% have visited more than 3 times. And it was, again, over 80% of Australian Jews see the survival of Israel as of personal importance to them. So this is an incredibly, amongst many of the diaspora Jewish communities, this is one of the most Zionist. So to platform the JCA's Nota Herzog charade has been questioned by some, kind of why this was platformed and not other things.
The details will come to light.
For sure.
I don't want to accuse, obviously. I think it's just when an organization offers to pay for an ad, I think there's a lot of times there's a lot of just negligence involved.
For sure.
But that being said, this does kind of segue into the broader conversation of what is Australia like today for Jews there.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's one thing that we're able to see this list and pick things apart and see the flaws and kind of realize that this might not be an accurate representation of how Jews in Australia actually feel. But I think, you know, my concern would be like for like a regular bystander who just sees this in a full page ad, they could see it and go, huh,
this is what
interesting. But even looking back, I remember after, you know, shortly after the massacre, we had an episode where we spoke to members of the Jewish community and also experts about, you know, is Australian Jewry safe is basically the main question that we're trying to answer. And, you know, on the one hand, there's an element of like the government, and is the government doing enough? Is the government enforcing? And we see that come into play now with like the extra measures and the protests, and are they doing enough, or are they at least trying? Are they taking it seriously? Are they not? And then there's an element of society, because, you know, you would think that, you know, when this horrific massacre happens in your country, there shouldn't be, you know, so much opposition to memorial, like regardless of who's coming. And so I would, my take on it is that, you know, at the time, I think there's a lot of scrutiny on Australia for not doing enough. I'm not saying they're doing enough now. Even if it's not an improvement, they're at least starting to take it very seriously.
Right.
Like they're playing ball, they're increasing efforts, the legislation changes to the protests. There's kind of efforts at least going on to show we consider this a serious issue. Whether it's actually enough or not is a separate conversation.
Right.
But I think societally, it really hasn't moved the needle at all.
Yeah.
At all. So I'm not really sure. But what's your take?
I have several things to say. I think first and foremost, there's always a significant disconnect between legislative changes and enforcement of those legislative changes. And I think Australia, although under some pressure, I mean, many will have read about Albanese's significant resistance to a royal commission into the Bondi massacre, preferring an internal one. But there have been some legislative moves, including the most recent new bill countering extremism and anti-Semitism bill, which has been significantly controversial, specifically for some of its clauses relating to free speech, etc., freedom, symbols of hate, these kind of things. But there have been efforts to introduce legislation that is going to help the Jewish community and help combat anti-Semitism. Most recently, Queensland, the state of Queensland, has introduced its new act to ban the chants of globalize the Intifada and from the river to the sea. Again, these are really, you know, real moves of legislation to try and aid the situation. Nevertheless, it remains to be seen whether these will be enforced. I mean, just yesterday at one of the protests, former Australian of the Year Grace Tame started a massive chant outside one of the main buildings in Sydney of globalize the Intifada, and she hasn't been arrested as far as I know. So it remains to be seen whether this is going to be enforced on the ground. Legislation is great, but are the police going to be arresting every person who posts on social media globalize the Intifada?
Right.
And is that necessarily even the right thing to be doing? And is that the best thing to be doing to help the Jewish community? Or does it kind of ostracize them and other them further? Again, this remains to be seen. But as you mentioned, policy aside, the attitudes of Australians seem to have not significantly shifted in many respects, despite the massacre, despite the legislation. We're seeing this with the huge turnout of protests. Nevertheless, again, Herzog said this morning in a speech in Australia that he believes the silent majority of Australians don't have any antipathy towards Jews and they don't agree with these protests, etc. So if that is the case, the silent majority need to be given the tools to kind of
make that be felt.
Exactly, make that be felt. Because at the moment, it's the very loud minority, if so, who are making a real sway. And it's also, many figures within Australian government who have been, expressed a lot of antipathy towards the new legislation, which is designed to protect the Jewish community.
Right.
So is there a future for Jews in Australia? Now, I'm not an Australian Jew myself. Obviously, there are many who I have spoken to who have said that they don't feel safe in Australia. Australian Jews living in Israel who say they feel frightened to go back. But there are also many Australian Jews who really want to focus on Jewish pride, on expressing their Jewish identity, on remaining in Australia and reinforcing Jewish existence. So I think it's not a one policy fits all. But in terms of the governmental response, moves have been made, but in general, in some ways, it's too little too late.
Mm-hmm.
It follows, years of escalation. It follows significant gaps in enforcement, significant lack of solidarity when it was needed.
Right.
And also Australia's, increasingly hostile stance towards Israel, which is something that's been called out on by Israeli politicians. So it remains, a lot of the mentions in Australia have been about 2032, the Olympics is going to be in Australia, and a lot of premiers have been saying we need to make sure that our country is inclusive and equal and diverse ahead of the Olympics so that people get a sense of what Australia is. But I think this is something that we're going to need to look at over the coming months. It's not something that can be determined today.
Yeah. So again, I also don't want to speak for Australian Jews. I feel that this visit is it's kind of like the first of many future litmus tests.
Yes.
To see if it's really okay for Jews there, because as this is kind of obviously there were like memorial services shortly after the massacre itself, which in and of itself there was also a lot of politics charged around either the events or comments made after, etc. But whatever. But this is kind of a revisitation, and now we're talking about sometime after, and this is also at a time where not that the war in Gaza is over. It's
right.
We're very much not out of the woods yet, but things have calmed down. Phase 2 of the ceasefire is more or less beginning and going forward, and all these other things. And so I think as an Australian Jew, if you see the amount of vitriol and turnout to his visit, with all of these factors taken into account, I would imagine it's terrifying.
For sure.
As in, when things are fresh, that's kind of something else. But the fact that this amount of vitriol and charge, so
it's definitely frightening, and also the fact that there's this significant rhetoric that I've seen about don't you weaponize the Bondi attack to kind of use anti-Semitism as a tool to crack down on freedom of speech. There's been there was a big drama with the Adelaide Writers' Festival, where the board of the festival decided to cancel a planned speaker because of her pro-Hamas, anti-Israel views that they felt would be culturally insensitive in the aftermath of Bondi, and all the statements was they're weaponizing Bondi to silence Palestinian voices.
It's insane that it's in the light of Bondi and it's not the pro-Hamas.
Exactly, and it's so insane that Jewish suffering, and this is the worst anti-Semitic terror attack in Australian history, if not the worst terror attack in Australian history in general.
Yeah.
And yet it's kind of the rhetoric is that it shouldn't be used to move the needle.
Right.
It shouldn't be used to learn lessons from. Don't weaponize this to crack down on freedom of speech. And obviously, there's always a balance between freedom of speech and protecting those who can be harmed by speech that's harmful. But essentially, to kind of criticize Jews wanting real change to protect them in the aftermath of such a horrific event, and deeming that to be somehow, authoritarian. It definitely indicates, as you said, there's the litmus test of kind of the public rhetoric, the public point of view that we're seeing currently in Australia.
Yeah, and it's like a theme that we discuss a lot on the
Mm.
show, which just comes up in conversation with a lot of my guests because it's just a very common occurrence where I think there's this kind of want to isolate incidents.
Yeah.
So like no matter how bad an incident
Yeah.
is, once you isolate it, it's easy to say like, this was bad, but it doesn't represent us as a society, and this
Yeah.
shouldn't set a blanket policy because this was like a one-off.
Right.
And while it's easy for non-Jews and it's easy for political figures to kind of look at everything through this lens of it's just this one time, and as horrific as it is, here it is, it happened, it's over. For Jews, it's just not the case.
Yeah.
When there's attack after attack after attack after attack, and it doesn't matter that one was here and one was there, and one was, it doesn't matter. It's this compounding fear that maybe it is a big deal, and maybe they're not isolated incidents. Maybe they're a bit more representative than we'd like to admit, and we should do something to address that.
Exactly. And it's so crazy. I speak to so many people. I mean, it's my job speaking to people, but I speak to so many diaspora communities, leaders, and they will say, what will it take for like our government to do something? Will it take a huge attack for them to like finally wake up? And yet we see in Australia a huge attack did happen and people still don't wake up.
Yeah.
And like, as you said, it's like, at what point are people just going to admit that it's not just like an anomaly that led to this? This is
historically
a pattern.
the answer is when it's way too late.
When it's way
the sad
too late.
truth, yeah.
And I don't want to be like in fear-mongering, and I'm not one of the voices who's like, everyone leave, come to Israel. I mean, I came to Israel and I love Israel and I live here. But I'm not advocating for people to do something that they're not willing to. And communities can make their own decision, individuals can make their own decisions. Nevertheless, I do think we need to be really clear about what's happening here, which is a repeated, coordinated in many cases, but repeated pattern of deeply anti-Semitic, hostile behavior.
Yeah.
Essentially Jew hatred. Anti-Semitism is almost a nice sounding word. What we're seeing here is hatred of Jews that leads to attacks, that leads to isolation, that leads to bullying in schools, that leads to graffiti and vandalism and the closure of Jewish businesses. And Australia is not the only one that, we can see this in, but it's definitely a strong example of a long-standing Jewish community that is beginning to be pushed out of a country.
Yeah. So again, this isn't, nothing is set in stone here, but I think if we look at the question of did the Bondi massacre, was that the catalyst that would make Australia wake up? I think we could safely analyze at this point that no. It wasn't.
It wasn't.
So yeah, it's crazy to see. Obviously it's important to discuss. And I could just say we only hope that maybe this visit will be the alarm bell that okay, the massacre didn't do enough, so maybe get your act together. But I guess we'll see.
And I'm not an optimist per se. I'm a realist with optimistic tendencies.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that this is going to be the wake up call that we may hope it will be.
And I mean either.
The visit isn't over yet. There's a couple more days. Hopefully nothing too dramatic happens, but we will be updating you if it does. So,
absolutely.
So remains to be seen.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on, letting us know what's
pleasure.
been going on. Well, that's all we have for today's episode. As always, thank you for watching, and we hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back in the same place next week, but until then, head over to jpost.com to stay up to date for all the latest news of Israel and the Jewish world.